Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining with me as we continue our look at the book of Proverbs. We are in chapter 10, and last week we ended by covering verse 14. And if you're new to this, we basically go through the books of the Bible that we're studying, in this case, the book of Proverbs, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, try to cover all the bases. So today we're going to begin by looking at verses 15 and 16. And the text reads this way. It says, "The wealth of the rich is their fortified city, but poverty is the ruin of the poor." And then in verse 16, he says, "The wages of the righteous bring them life, but the income of the wicked bring them punishment." Now, if you are relatively new or unfamiliar with the book of Proverbs, you may not know, but the book of Proverbs speaks actually quite extensively about money. And it has a lot to do with how we need to develop a balanced perspective about money, because I find that many Christians are very conflicted about it. I mean, we have one segment of the church that says that your virtue in the eyes of God is measured by how much money you have. The richer you are, the more that God loves you. We call that the prosperity gospel, and it's something that I don't support or recommend you get invested in. But on the other side, there's the kind of this poverty gospel as well, where people are saying your spirituality is measured by how poor or how indigent you are. And basically, Scripture doesn't recommend either one of those things per se, although they have certain benefits and drawbacks to each of them. One of the things we have to always keep in mind when we talk about money is that money is inert. It doesn't really have personality. It isn't good or bad. Basically, it's like anything, whether you have a gun or a rock or a club or a hammer. It's a matter of what you do with it that really determines whether it's good for you or bad for you. So it's really a non-issue. And so when we kind of throw out these platitudes of saying, well, money is the root of all evil, then we're really missing what the text actually says. What Paul said to the Ephesians, he says, the love of money is the root of all evil. And the word love that he uses there in the original language is having an inordinate affection for it. So we would call it maybe a greedy desire for more. And basically, it's based upon the concept that money is the key to happiness. Now, somebody once said that money makes the world go around. And I would say that kind of echoes something we read in the scriptures where Solomon said money is the answer to all things. In other words, what he meant by that, in that translation at least, is that if you really want to understand what drives almost everything, it's going to be the financial gain is going to be at the root of it. And that's why many times in criminal investigations, they'll often say, follow the money. Because money is this, or at least the desire for money, is one of the driving motivations of people's lives. To me, to say to you that that's incorrect or it's imbalanced, I think is kind of obvious, because oftentimes a desire for money can drive us to be behaving in unethical ways or immoral ways. Dishonesty oftentimes is simply rooted in the idea that I want to attain increased wealth because I think that it'll make me happier, it'll make me more satisfied or safer. And that's kind of not necessarily true, because you can see plenty of people who have large amounts of wealth, they're very prosperous, and you can tell they're still looking for happiness. They still are pressing, after the golden idol, if you will. And the more you do worship it as a source of happiness, the more unhappy you'll be. Now, on the other side of the equation, poverty can actually be a blessing. I mean, what it tends to do is it fosters faith. James put it this way: those who are poor in this world are rich in faith towards God. And I know that for a good part of my life, my marriage life, and my wife and I, we were very poor. And, it caused us to pray a lot. I mean, it's interesting because we didn't look at people who had resources and say, I wish we were them. We just have realized that was where God had put them. He hadn't put us in that place. And so we prayed, and we discovered that God answers prayer. In fact, in Proverbs 10:22, it says, "The blessing of the Lord brings wealth, and he adds no trouble to it." So how do you know if God is the source of financial prosperity in your life? Well, if it comes and it's a blessing to you, and it's not, and there's no troubles or problems that follow along with it, well, that's probably something that God has done. He's blessed you with it, but the reason he's blessed you is because he knows that you won't seek to replace him as a center of your life, and instead put money in that throne where you worship it and you become enslaved to it, really. Because money is a very cruel master. It demands a lot of you. And that's where it comes down to, for example, in Romans chapter 6, Paul said that whatever you give yourself over to serve, you become the slave of that thing. And so many people, they think that if they have enough money, they can purchase freedom and liberty. And maybe what they're really talking about is a license to do what otherwise you could not do, and in many cases should not do. But nonetheless, what it does is whatever you give yourself over to, you will become enslaved by that, including money or the passions and the desires you try to fulfill by the acquisition of more and more money. I really think when we want to put it in right perspective, I like the saying of Agur, which is probably a pseudonym for Solomon in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 8. I think he hits it right on the head, right on the nose, where he said, "Give me neither poverty or riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, 'Who is the Lord?'" In other words, great wealth often leads to kind of a self-sufficiency and a kind of arrogance, a false sense of security. And you begin to feel like you're independent instead of being dependent upon God. All the good things that come to us through the hand of God, not through hands full of money. And that may be hard for you to believe right now, especially if you're in a place where you don't have enough money to make ends meet. And I would just simply say, I don't encourage poverty. I don't think poverty is necessarily virtuous in itself. But whether we're rich or we're poor, what we should be pursuing is virtue. Godliness. That's what we should be pursuing, without regards to whether we have enough or don't have enough. And that's why Solomon goes on to say, "Don't make me so rich that I'll say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or may I become poor and steal, and so dishonor the name of my God." In other words, there is a degree of poverty that people can come to where they're so desperate that they actually are willing to do things that are illegal and dishonest. And you may be in that state right now and say, "Well, you don't understand. I have to do that." Well, let me tell you this. What you're doing is you're doubting that God is able to meet your need. So I find that sometimes people, even Christians, will lie about Social Security, or they'll lie about welfare payments, or they'll lie about other things. They'll try to borrow money that they know they never plan on repaying and never can. And instead of sitting back and saying, "Lord, you know what my needs are. You know the impossibility of my situation. And I'm asking you, God, to open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing." It's one of those things that, in fact, in Malachi, the Lord said, "Test me on this. Test me on this. See if I can't be trusted, see that I can't be found to be reliable." But at the end of the day, it comes down to what Paul said and what the writer of Hebrews said. Paul in 1 Timothy 6:8, he says, "Having food and clothing, with these be content." In fact, he goes on to say, contentment with godliness is great gain. He says some people think gain is godliness, and it's not. But he says if you have contentment, that's the greatest gain that you can come to in your life. And one of the things I have been often reminded, and as I get older, I'm really reminded of, is that your life is going to come to an end, and you brought nothing into this world, and you're not going to be able to take anything out of this world. And so the fact is that if I have enough to sustain me comfortably through the rest of my life, then I count myself a rich man. Whether I am driving the kind of car that I might imagine I should drive, or house I dream that I could live in, or any of those kind of life accoutrements that we try to accumulate around us, the reality is that if I'm not content with all the riches in the world, I'm not going to be content with anything. And if I'm not content in the midst of poverty, I would never be content with wealth either. So what we look at and saying, God, what I have is what you have given me, and I'm going to thank you for what I have. Give us this day our daily bread, he said. That should be our prayer. And that's why the writer of Hebrews added along. He said, let your conduct be without covetousness, that yearning desire for more. But he says, be content with such things as you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. In fact, Jesus put it very simply. He says, if you have clothing and you have food, and we might add that's implied in that shelter to protect us from the storms and all the rest of those things, to keep us, in other words, reasonably healthy and sane. He says, if you have those kind of things, then be thankful. But the person who lives always wanting more is a vicious, unkind, aggressive slave driver that will take any happiness out of your existence away and leave you feeling very empty inside. Well, we'll continue tomorrow as we look at verse 17. Blessings.